right, so now we're moving into one of the big things, which is respiration. So this is one of our major topics for this particular body system, where we're going to talk about the three processes involved. We're going to talk about how pressure changes allow for ventilation to happen. We're going to talk about Boyle's law, which you need to know that. And then we're going to talk about what the changes are made in the thoracic cavity for inhalation and exhalation, and what are some of the forces that influence this, as well as what the role of the surfactant is. I know I introduced that in the last video when talking about type 2 alveolar cells, but now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty. So I've been saying respiration a lot. Now respiration specifically is talking about the exchange of gases, right? And so this is really a three-part process rather than a single action or a single item. Number one, we need ventilation. Ventilation is just breathing. Now it's important to note respiration and ventilation are not the same thing. Ventilation is the movement of air in and out of the lungs, like in and out of the chest. Respiration is the actual gases making the movement, right? Making movement. So ventilation is the act of breathing. Respiration is the act of actually exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide. And respiration can be broken down to two sides, the external respiration and the internal respiration. And I know it gets a little confusing because when you hear external, you think outside and you're like, well, the lungs are in there. External respiration does refer to the exchange between the lungs, right, in the lungs, between the alveoli and the blood. So the air that is in the lungs and the bloodstream that is in close contact with it. The internal respiration is happening in all the other tissues. This is between the systemic capillaries, so the capillaries we find all throughout the body, and the tissues that they come into contact with. So ventilation, we're talking about moving air, airflow between the atmosphere and inside the alveoli of the lungs, right? And basically what we're doing is we're creating some differences in pressure between the inside and the outside of the body, right? The inside of the thoracic cavity and the outer environment. And so just like anything else, things like to go from a high to a low concentration, a high to a low pressure, a high to low whatever, right? Things like to go from high to low until equilibrium is reached. And we're going to take advantage of that with ventilation as well. So we have what we call the atmospheric pressure, which is the pressure outside of your body. And then we have what's called the intrapulmonary pressure, which is the pressure found inside your lungs. So your lungs are going to be pushing, right? They're going to be kind of pushing in a certain direction, creating a certain pressure, right? That is going to be different from the pressure on the outside. Now I mentioned that we're taking advantage of the fact that things like to go from a high to a low concentration, a high to a low pressure, a high to low whatever. And this is where we get into Boyle's law, Boyle's gas law. I'm just going to call it Boyle's law for short. So Boyle's law states that the volume of a gas is going to be inversely related to its pressure, right? Basically, this means as the pressure increases, the volume decreases. And the reason why this is because a gas doesn't have a specific volume that it takes up, right? A solid, there's a specific volume that solid takes up. A liquid, you can compress it a little bit maybe, but not a lot. It's going to be very limited in the volume it can take up. A gas, though, is a little bit different from both of those in that the gas is going to fill the space it's given, right? So because a gas will fill the space it's given, the volume of a gas can change. And it's going to change in relation to the space you give it. The more space you give it, the gas is going to expand and distribute itself out. But if you give it a smaller space, those molecules of that gas are going to be closer together, and that's where the pressure comes in. So pressure increase, if the pressure increases, the volume decreases. Now this is important to note, all of this is true if we keep the temperature constant. So that the temperature is not going to change in this case, right? But we see this inverse relationship between pressure and volume. And so we're going to take advantage of this with the body as well, because if we increase the volume in the lungs, in the thoracic cavity, when we inspire or breathe in, this is going to decrease the pressure of the air inside of the lungs. And so because we've decreased the pressure inside, the pressure inside the lungs is lower than the outside atmospheric pressure, and so air will be pulled in. It'll rush in. If we decrease the lungs volume, so when like we're expiring or breathing out, right, that's going to cause an increase in that intrapulmonary pressure. So the pressure inside the lungs goes up, and that's going to force air out. So here we're looking at just kind of the cycle, right? So atmospheric pressure is about 760 milligrams or millimeters of mercury, right? That's not really going to change. What's going to change is the pressure that we have inside the lungs, right? So what we find is that the alveolar pressure, it's about 760, matching the outside, right? But the intrapleural pressure is 756. Now, as we breathe in, this diaphragm moves down. The ribs, you can't tell from this picture, but the ribs move up and out due to the intercostal muscles. That's going to create a bigger space here. And so we see that the intrapleural pressure goes down by a couple, right? It goes down to 754. And so because it's 754, right, in this pressure, and the alveolar pressure has dropped now to 758, it's lower than the atmospheric pressure. Air is going to be pulled in. Now, when we exhale, the diaphragm moves back up. The ribs move back down and in. All right, and so both of our pressures, the interpleural pressure goes up to 756, and the alveolar pressure goes up to 762, which is higher than the atmospheric pressure. That's going to force air out. So we're just going through this cycle, right, where diaphragm moves down, ribs move up and out, thoracic space is now bigger, the lungs can expand more, the pressure is lower than atmospheric pressure, air rushes in. And then to exhale, ribs move down and in, diaphragm moves back up, the thoracic space is smaller. This is going to increase the pressure inside the lungs, air is forced out. So inhalation is an active process, so we are going to be contracting muscles for this to happen. So the diaphragm contracts, the intercostal muscles contract, right? That makes it active, right? You actively have to do something to inhale and to cause that thoracic space to expand. And so that's going to lead the lung volume to increase, lung pressure drops, right? We inhale. Now, normally, right, so we're going to talk about what's happening normally. Normally we have the diaphragm. This is really the big piece to this puzzle. So it's normally kind of like a sideways C, right, with like kind of a dome shape. And when we inhale, right, that diaphragm was going to contract, and when it contracts, it flattens out and down, right? It's going to flatten down. And so that's going to create a bigger space inside the thoracic cavity when it flattens down. It's going to be responsible for most of the air we breathe, about 3/4 of it. Now, the external and the parasternal intercostal muscles, these are going to, when they contract, they're going to move the ribs up and out. And so that's also going to increase the space. And if you inhale, you can feel this process, right? Especially you can notice the intercostal muscle one, right? If you can actually physically feel it or notice it, right? That the space is getting bigger there. Now, even though it's more dramatic for us to notice, the intercostal muscles are only responsible for about 1/4 of the lung that gets in. So when we go to forceful inhalation, so like we're really trying to inhale like deeply, you'll probably notice that like part of your neck and your chest is involved, and so that's going to be the sternocleidomastoid muscles, the pectoralis minor muscles, right? Some of these guys are going to be involved in when it comes to that deep inhalation that you make beyond normal. And so again, we mentioned this before, but the volume of the thoracic cavity is going to change when the ribs move up and out when we breathe in, right? So it gets bigger when our ribs move up and out for inhalation. And then that same space shrinks down when the ribs move down and in, right back to normal when we breathe out during exhalation. The diaphragm, again, is this like dome-shaped one, this muscle that when it contracts, it's going to flatten out, right? This is going to make the thoracic cavity larger during inspiration. During breathing in, it's going to relax to go back up to its dome shape. This makes the thoracic cavity smaller during expiration or exhaling. And then these are just some of the muscles that can be involved, right? So we see like the sternocleidomastoid, right? If we're looking at inhalation, breathing in, the scalenes that we see there, the external intercostals, the diaphragm, those are going to be helpful. And then exhalation, we see internal intercostals helping along with some of the obliques and abdominal muscles. Now, exhalation is normally passive because muscles are relaxing. So during a normal exhalation, the muscles like the external intercostals, the diaphragm, they're relaxing. And so we consider this passive. Now, if you forcefully exhale, you will use your abs, right? You'll use your abdominal muscles and whatnot to force air out, right? More than you normally would. But during normal restful exhalation, again, diaphragm and external intercostal muscles relax, right? Things shrink back down, and then air escapes. And so again, we're just looking at the muscles involved in the inhalation and exhalation. Now, some things are going to help influence ventilation. Some things are going to go against inhalation. Other things are going to help. So number one that's going to oppose inhalation is surface tension. So this is in the alveoli. Basically, the alveoli want to collapse, and we have to overcome that force, right, to allow us to inhale and to expand the lungs. So they want to collapse down. We have to actively fight against that. And this is why we have like the surfactant to help us fight against the collapsing in. Elastic recoil is also going to oppose inhalation. So this elasticity, it can stretch, but it wants to return back down to normal. So this is the force generated by these bronchioles that have this elastic tissue, the force that these bronchioles want to collapse to their smallest diameter, and this is what's going to allow you to breathe out, right? So that it wants to snap back. Just like if you can pull a rubber band, right? You can pull a rubber band a bunch, but at the end of the day, the rubber band wants to return to its smallest diameter. And then resistance, there is some resistance, right, to normal flow of air into the lungs when we look at the bronchi and bronchioles. And then compliance, this is the ease of the expansion. So this is your lungs and thoracic wall's ability to expand and stretch, right? And if you have certain diseases like COPD or pulmonary fibrosis, you lose compliance. That stretchiness, that expansiveness is lost. So let's go ahead and talk about the surfactant. This is basically an active agent that is going to fight against the collapse of the alveoli when we breathe out. So it's going to help keep the alveoli open even when we're exhaling. This is coming from the type 2 alveolar cells. It's a hydrophobic protein with some phospholipids, and this is to reduce the surface tension between water molecules. Right? Basically, it prevents water molecules from sticking to each other, from forming those hydrogen bonds, so we don't get that like water molecules like pulling on each other. So this will help prevent the alveoli from collapsing in, and this means that there's always going to be a little bit of air left in your lungs even when you exhale, because if you exhaled all of the air in your lungs, your alveoli would fully collapse. So this leftover air that's inside the alveoli, even after exhalation, is what we call the residual volume.